Hi, I'm Michael D'Souza from Aspericity. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about how to make REST requests from a Node Express app using Axios. And we're going to make those to a local Headless Ghost CMS that we did in the last video. In a future video, we'll integrate this Node Express app with a React front end. Let's get started. So the first step is to create the Node.js app. And we can do that by creating a test node directory. You can call it whatever you want. I'm calling it test node. And then we'll switch over to that directory. And then we'll run an npm init -y. And this command will create a package.json that will point to the index.js as the main JS file for this application, and basically create some default values for your package.json file. The next step is to install the dependencies. So I'm actually going to install them one at a time, but you could do them all at once if you'd like. We have 3 dependencies that we need to install. The first is Express, and this will take maybe a second or two to run. And then we can install Axios, which handles or makes the REST requests. And the last is that we're going to install .env. And .env is used for creating environment variables, which we'll use to provide some minimal security for the API content key that we use to be able to access content from the Ghost CMS. Okay, so the last thing, I typically just run an npm I, which is short for npm install, just to make sure that we have all our dependencies. And then the last thing we can do here is run a code dot, which will run VS Code in the directory or project that you've created. So while that is starting, I'm just going to come over here and grab this README file and copy it. And then I'll come back to this new window, maximize it, right click and click paste. So we have this README here. I'm just going to open the preview for that. Okay, so we've gone ahead and done all the setup for our Node.js project. The next step is to actually go and create a new index.js file. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay, we've created our index.js, and the first step is to create or to bring in the dependencies. So we do a require and then .env and then .config. Next one, we'll create a constant called express, and we'll just require express. And then we need a constant called router, and that is the express.router command that we need to run. And lastly, a const for Axios. Okay, so that's all our dependencies. The first thing I just would want to do here for the purposes of this demo is to do a quick console log where we say Node.js server is starting, so that we'll have something in our console that shows us that this code is starting when we run it. The next step is to actually do the router.get command, which is going to handle when you do a get to a specific endpoint. And typically what we by convention want to do is use the /API, and then in this case we're going to make it clear that it's Ghost, and since we want this one to get the posts. So the second parameter we want to pass to the router.get method is a callback function. And it takes 2 parameters, the request and the response, and it's an arrow function. And inside this arrow function, we're actually going to create another function called getPosts. This function is asynchronous, so we use the async keyword, And again, another arrow function. And in here, we're going to start with a try block. So create another variable here called response, which is going to receive the response from the Axios call that we're going to make. So we use await because it's asynchronous, and then we say Axios dot get. And here, just hit enter, we actually need the URL that we're passing. So I'm going to go over to Postman, which we did in our last video, and go and grab the get posts. So this is going to go to the Ghost Content API CMS headlessly and go and request this from this endpoint, the posts. And in fact, we also have a parameter here that's the Content API key that allows us to securely request this data. And we'll see how we're going to use that when I flip back to the other screen. Okay, so I'm going to paste it all in, and I'm actually going to have to remove part of that URL. But for now, we're just going to put the second part of this get method, the second parameter here, which actually is a params object. And so we define it like this, and inside here, it actually takes a key. And the key is this value here, which we're going to do as a string. So I'm going to cut that out, paste it right here, hit comma, and we're all set. We just need to remove this one little extra part here. And at this point, this Axios request is ready to go. So if this request was successful, the last thing we need to do is return a response. So we do a res.json, and inside we're going to return posts, and we're going to use the response.data.posts. So this is what we're going to return if we have a successful request by Axios back to the Ghost content management system. Okay, so the last thing we need here is a catch with an error. And for now, we're just going to console log that, although obviously we probably want something a little bit more robust if we're creating an actual system. Okay, so that should be everything we need to do the get posts. The last thing we just need to add here is that we actually call get posts. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is to configure Express. So that's fairly simple. We just have to create a constant called app and set it equal to Express. And then we do an app use express.json. Finally, an app use and then router. And then finally, we just need to set the port that the server is going to listen on. I'll set that to 5000. And then lastly, I'm just going to set up a console log to let us know that the server is ready to handle requests on port 5000. So first, I'm going to switch back to my other VS Code terminal. And in here, I'm just going to go and change directory into my Ghost directory and quickly run Ghost. So I'm going to do a Ghost start, and momentarily that should begin here. Okay, now that that's started, I'm going to flip over to Postman and just quickly make sure that we can do a request. And we can see that the request to localhost 2368, where Ghost runs locally, was successful, and it returned a list of Ghost posts. So if we go back to the test node project, I'm just going to run the terminal here as well. And in here, we just need to run a node index.js. And we can see that the server has started and it's ready to handle requests on port 5000. So if we flip back to Postman, let's create a new collection. We'll call it test node. Click create. And in test node, I actually want to create another request. So we'll do an add request. We'll call it get posts. We'll save it. Okay, so I'm going to quickly flip back to VS Code and grab this URL here, which is the URL that we want to make in our request. So come back to Postman, paste in that request, and we don't need any parameters here because our endpoint is just API Ghost posts, and the Node.js server will handle adding the Ghost content API. So we're keeping the credential on the server. So let's click send, and there we are. We've successfully now used our Node.js server to get the post and act as an intermediary. Okay, so the next step that I'd like to do, and I'll just flip back to the README file here, is we'd like to replace the inline API content key with an environment variable. So right now in the index.js, we're just storing this API key in line with the code. We want to remove that so that when we put it into our content version control like Git, that we're not actually sending this value up, and it's only being stored on a file that would reside on the server but not be posted to any public repositories. So let's come back here, and we're just going to grab this piece of code, and I'm going to go and create a .env file. And in that .env, we've created a key called Ghost Content API key, and we just need to come back to our index.js, select that string for the content API, and we'll paste it over this placeholder. And now we need to call it here. And we can do that by going process.env dot and paste in the key value. So now if I go and shut down our server and restart it, it's ready to go again. And I'm going to come back here and rerun the request. And we can see, once again, it's working. And this time, we no longer have in the code that value. We're substituting it with an environment value. So the last thing I'd like to do here is just create one more request on our Node.js server where we go ahead and do a get, but we're actually going to do a single get by ID. So all we have to do that is slightly change the endpoint and add a variable here. And then we're just going to change the name of this constant so that we know that it's by ID. And lastly, right here, we're going to add that variable inline in the string by using the dollar bracket notation and doing a request dot params dot ID, and then again another backtick. Okay, you just come down here, update the variable, or sorry, the method name, and we're all set. So we've got another handler that handles a get to this endpoint where the last part of the endpoint path is this dynamic ID value. Okay, so all we have left to do is restart the server, and then we can go back to Postman And we're just going to create a new request. We'll call it get posts by ID. Save it. And in this request, it's basically the same endpoint, except we need to add that ID piece. So we're just going to come back to this request and pick one of the IDs at random here. Grab this one for publishing options, copy it, come back to the get post by ID, paste that in, and we click send. And there we have it. We have the single post. Okay, so to summarize, we've gone ahead and replaced the inline content key with an environment variable. So that provides a little extra security. It's not as secure as if we encrypted that value, but at least it's only available on the server. And as well, we've done 2 requests. We've made a get request that gets us all the posts, and we've done a second get request that gets us a single post by ID, which we can then use with a client like Postman to make that request, or later, and in the next video, we'll use React to go ahead and make that request, and then we can use the response to populate our web page. If you like the code from this tutorial, it's available publicly on the Asperity GitHub site. I'd like to thank you guys for watching this video. If this tutorial was useful, hit like. If you're interested in more videos like this, hit subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below. Otherwise, stick around for the next video in this series, and thanks again.